Good evening, everyone. This week's Parshat is Parshat Vayeitzei, Tafshin Pei. We'll begin at the beginning of the Parsha, which is Perek Chavches, chapter 28, Pasuk Yud, verse 10. Vayeitzei Yaakov Be'er Shava. Yaakov left Be'er Shava. Vayelech Haran, he went to Haran, following the directive of his parents to go to Haran to find a wife. And as his mother wanted him to escape the anger of his brother Esav. Vayifka b'makom. He met the place, he encountered the place. Vayolin sham kiva hashemesh. He slept there for the sun had set. Vayikach me'avnei hamakom vayasem rasha Esav. He took from the stones of the place, and he placed them around his head. Vayishka b'makom ahu, and he slept in that place. Okay, so now we're going to focus on this second pasuk. We're going to focus on something that Rashi brings down. But before we actually, so to speak, go through Rashi, we're going to start at what is the source of Rashi, or at least the source of part of what Rashi says. And this comes from the Talmud in Chulin, Tzadik Aleph Amid Beis 91b. So the Gemara says like this: Ksiv, it's written, Vayikach me'avnei hamakom, and he took from the stones of the place. That is the verse that we just read, Pasuk Yud Aleph, verse 11. Okay, there it says, and he took from the stones of the place. Now, later on, after the dream of the ladder, if you skip to Pasuk Tazayin, verse 16, no, not that one. Actually, Pasuk Yud Ches, verse 18. Vayashkem Yaakov, and Yaakov got up in the morning. Vayashkem Yaakov baboker. Yaakov awoke in the morning. Vayikach esa even asher sam rash Esav, and he took the stone that he had placed around his head. He erected it as a monument. And he poured oil on top of it. Okay, so now the Talmud first cites Pasuk Yud Aleph, Vayikach me'avnei hamakom. He took from the stones of the place, and then later on in verse 18 it says Vayikach eso even, and he took the stone. So one verse says he took from the stones of the place. The other one says he took the stone. Do you hear a contradiction? You hear a contradiction?
No.
One verse says, and he took from the stones of the place. And then later on it says, and he took the stone.
It's moved the stones one place to another.
Okay, but what's the contradiction between these two verses? Okay, so let's go a little bit further. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak said, Melamed, this teaches us, Sheneshkabtsu kol oisen avodim l'makim echad, all the stones gathered together in one place. Chalachas vachas ameres olayaniach tzadik zeh roishai. Each one says that tzadik should rest his head on him. That's that. So again, all the stones came together and said that tzaddik should rest his head on them. Each one wanted a tzaddik to rest his head on it. And then what happened at the end is they all became one.
So
You remember? You're familiar with that?
yeah.
So, but the Gemara says, the Gemara seems to say the basis is for this is because we have a contradiction. One pasuk says he took from the stones, which is plural. And then it says at the end, he took the stone, which is singular. So we got a problem. Therefore, the Gemara says that how do we answer the contradiction? We say it started off at many stones, right? And the many stones started quarreling. Who should Yaakov rest his head upon? And then the miracle happened. They all became one, so that they should all have the chance. Okay. So we're not. So okay. So that's what the Gemara says. So now I want to throw a little bit of a what would seemingly be a monkey wrench in this. You ready? Ready? Okay. If the Gemara quotes one verse and then another verse, the Gemara seems to be saying we've got a contradiction. And the contradiction seems to be in one place it says stones, which is plural. Then it says stone, which is singular. And the way to answer that is to say the many stones became one. Right?
Okay.
So in the Talmud, there's the commentary. You have the commentary of Rashi on one side. You have the commentary of Tosfos on the other side. Tosfos are known as the Tosafists, They lived after Rashi. Some of them were grandchildren of Rashi, and they lived in France. And the group of scholars in France in 1400s, that they were the leading rabbis of France, the leading scholars, and their comments to the Talmud also appears on our standard, on the way we have the Talmud printed. You've got the Talmud in the middle, you got Rashi on one side, and Tosfos on the other side. So Tosfos makes the following comment, and he's saying it on when the Gemara says Vayikach. The Gemara, he actually says it on the second pasuk, where the Gemara says Vayikach es ha'eved. He took the stone. Says Tosfos, Lefi pshutai. You ever heard of the word pshat?
Yes.
Pshat means the simple interpretation. We call it the basic interpretation. Lefi pshuta yesh lefarish. According to the simple interpretation of the verses, we can explain. Shalakach even achas me'avnei hamakim. He took one stone from the stones of the place. Meaning, you have one pasuk. The first pasuk says he took from the stones of the place. The place had many stones, but how many stones did he take?
One.
The answer is the next pasuk tells you. The pasuk tells you one.
Maybe biggest.
What?
Maybe biggest.
Whatever. But at the end of the day, right? The words Tosfos is saying, Lefi pshutai, according to the pshat, according to the mixed interpretation, we have an answer to this contradiction. I mean, there is no contradiction. You say that the first pasuk says he took from the stones of the place. Doesn't say how many stones, but it was he took from the stones of the place. Stones is going on the stones of the place, not going on what he took necessarily. It's not necessarily saying what he took. Okay, so how many did he take from the stones of the place? The next pasuk, later on, the pasuk says he took the stone. It was one. So Tosfos is saying, right? Tosfos is saying that we don't really have a contradiction because I just gave you an answer. But if I just give an answer to the contradiction, then where's the Gemara coming from?
No, because it's 11 little Mosen take one.
Who said?
No, but this.
Who said?
I read.
I know you read, but you're reading. What you read is because of what the Talmud says. But the Talmud says it seemingly based on the contradiction. If Tosfos says there's no contradiction, then what's the basis? Okay, what's the basis? Or we're trying to make it be based in the word based on the verses. So here is a very important rule to know. Very important rule to know. You've heard of pshat, right? You heard of drash or medrash?
What? The story.
Okay, you say stories. Okay, but it's not just stories. Here's the way. I'll read to you how a rabbi in Israel, Emmanuel Bernstein, how he lays it out here. Okay, so he says like this. The word pshat derives from the word pashut. You know what pashut means? Simple. That's the word. Pshat is related to the word pashut, which means simple.
Pshat is not simple. Pshat.
No, pshat means the simple interpretation. But the actual word for simple is pashut. Okay? But this type of interpretation is called pshat. Okay? Which means simple or straightforward. The goal of pshat is to read the verse in a way whereby the straightforward meaning of the words emerges. That means, as he says also, pshat explains the verse in terms of what can be derived from the words using the disciplines of language, syntax, and grammar. That means, if you take these words, right, and based on the language, its meaning, its grammar, it's how you formulate sentences, right? That if you can read it, if you can read the words in that way, that's pshat. And that's called a straightforward explanation. I look at the words, I read the words. When I read them, how do I read them? How do I understand it based on reading them? Again, according to the straightforward understanding, which is based on language and on grammar and on the formulation of sentences. So, if I take these two verses, he took from the stones of the place, and then another verse says he took the stone. Okay? The straightforward way of explaining this is he took from the stones of the place, doesn't say how many, and the next verse tells you how many, which was one. That's the pshat. The drash means something else. Drash derives from the word lidrosh, which means to seek. Drash seeks a resolution of aspects of the verse beyond that which the pshat requires. It pays attention to details which do not present an impediment to a straightforward understanding, which upon a closer inspection require resolution nonetheless. That means, Drash says, okay, you made sense of the words? Fine. But I have a question. I have questions. I have other questions on the verse. Even after you told me how to explain the words according to the straightforward meaning. But now I have other questions. And those other questions need to be resolved. And how are they going to be resolved? On that he writes, Drash explains and expounds the verse using a broader spectrum of meaning, including allusions to further ideas, as well as further information relating to that situation known to, or as well as further information relating to that situation known to the sages through tradition. Drash says, I have a question. The question needs to be answered. And the way it's going to be answered now is actually by sometimes you'll expand the meaning. Sometimes you'll say there's further meaning to this, or even maybe a different meaning to it. Or there's going to be certain details that are left out from the Torah that we have a tradition about them, and now we use them to explain to answer the question.
What is question?
So what's the question here? Okay, very good. You're following the approach here. So what's the question here? Here's the question, and this is explained by the commentary on Rashi, known as Mizrahi, Rabbeinu Eliyahu Mizrahi. He was also an early sage, I think, from the 1500s, and he wrote a commentary on Rashi. Many people wrote commentaries on Rashi. He's the earliest, I believe. Now, he says like this. He says the question is like this. If the first pasuk that we quote, that he took from the stones of the place, right, means that he took, we don't know how many stones, right, but he took the stones from the place, and later on it's one. So why didn't the first time the Torah say it was one? Why does the Torah have to be vague? Why does the Torah have to tell us it took from the stones when really it's only one? And if it's really only one, so say one right away. And it's not like the Torah never does that. There's another example. There's an example in Parshat Beshalach, which again, we don't have any contradiction there. But the Torah tells us in Parshat Beshalach, when the Jewish people were fighting a war against Amalek, that Moshe Rabbeinu held up his hands in prayer. And when he was getting tired, what did he do? They took a stone and he sat down on the stone. So, the same way there, the Torah says they took a stone. Here, the Torah could have right away said, and he took a stone. If all he did was take one stone, if that's what happened, then that's what the Torah should have said. Why does the Torah have to be vague and say he took from the stones, and then later tell us how many? It was one. Tell us it was one right away. That's the question. Now, because of that question, we have to say that the verse that says, and he took from the stones, doesn't mean he just took one stone from the stones, but it says he took from the stones. He took a couple of stones. He took more than one stone. Well, if so, then we have a problem with the pasuk with the verse later on that says he took one. And because of that, we now say, oh, what happened? Yeah, and I think we can apply what he says. It's a tradition that they had, but now they apply it to the verse. They find a source for it in the Torah itself. And that is, the stones started as many and then became one. And this comes up in a lot of places. Where the Pshat tells you there's a way to read the words according to the Pshat, according to the straightforward explanation. I like the word straightforward better than simple. The straightforward explanation, but when you scrutinize the verse more, meaning when you don't just it makes sense. The words make sense, fine. But when you start thinking more, you scrutinize, you delve more, you're looking for more, meaning you have questions, you have more questions, and you need to answer those questions. That's now going to be, so to speak, the springboard. That's going to be the place now to go further than what the Pshat conveyed to you. So this is just an important idea to know in general when it comes to understanding the words of the Torah, and we talk about Pshat, we talk about Drash. Now, the next thing about this is the following. Okay. Now, okay. So the Talmud doesn't say, though, when he took the many stones, why did he take them? Doesn't say. All the Talmud says is, it brings out the two verses, and it says it teaches us that these many stones came together. Each one says that Tzaddik Sheres his head on me, and at the end, they all became one.
But this is directly say why. To have something to as pillow.
Oh, you're saying it's a pillow.
Yeah.
It says it put it, Marash Osav, okay, you say it's a pillow.
No, like pillow.
Okay.
Under
his head, right? So Marash Osav, do they translate as under his head?
No, something like that.
Something like that.
No, this is what
I understand, but I want to know, they translate as under his head or around his head? I'm asking from the Russian one.
No, this was the words understand.
All right.
Besides the head.
All right. Now, besides the head.
No,
okay. All right. Wait a minute. Good. One second. But you're saying, which would make a lot of sense in the Gemara, that he was going to use it under his head as a pillow of sorts. Strange pillow, but okay. He was going to use it as a pillow. So all the stones came together and said, I want to be the one. And the miracle happened. They all became one. And they all became his pillow. Okay. Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi starts off on these words, and it says he put it around his head. So Rashi says, basically, he put it around his head as a protection because he was afraid of the wild animals. And that's a medrash. He doesn't quote the Talmud there. He quotes the medrash. He put the stones around his head for protection. Okay, so let me ask you a question. He's basically like making a wall around him, right? So that the animals shouldn't see him.
But this is still talking about head.
If it's only his head, right? What's the rest? What about the rest of him? So one of the other commentaries on Rashi called Maskela David says that it means when he put up the rocks as a protection, he put them all around him. But there's a reason why the Torah only mentions the rocks around his head.
No, most important part?
No. But he also wants to say, now we'll get back to this soon, okay? But again, you want to say most important? Okay.
For the animal. If your animal...
Well, if they see your legs, they're not going to bother you as much if they see your head?
No, but the animal leg is still alive. If an animal do something with your legs, it's not the same as...
So did he put the rocks around his legs or not?
For this, not.
Okay, well, the Maskell of it says he did. Because it makes sense that you don't want the animal biting your leg either. Okay? You're right? So he put it all around him. But then we have to talk, so why don't we mention his head? We'll get back to that. Okay, let's get back to what we started talking. So Rashi says he made a thing around him, right? And he put it around his head, around his body, right? Around his head. Then Rashi, now, according to that, yeah? Just stop right there. So now, should we say that all those stones around his head started saying that Tzaddik Sheres his head on me? Does that follow? No. Because the whole point is to have the rocks around his head for protection. If you put down one rock as a pillow, right?
It's not protected.
Then you're not protected. Okay? So if you explain that the reason for the rocks is a protection, then it shouldn't follow, right? What the Gemara about the rocks coming together and saying he should rest his head on me. He's not resting his head on anyone. Okay, so sometimes you have a medrash that says one thing, and a Gemara that says another thing, and I don't agree. Okay, that's not the end of the world. The problem is that right after Rashi brings down that he put up the stones around his head for protection, he does bring the Gemara in Chulin that we just said. Rashi says, first he says, Asan kamin marzev savar l'roishoi sheripnei chayas rois. He made them like a marzev means a gutter, but it means he put it around his head to protect him from the wild animals. And they began, and now that's the first part of Rashi. And that's sourced from a medrash. And then it says, they started fighting with each other. This one says, it's tzaddik should rest on me. And the other one says, it's tzaddik should rest on me. What did Hashem do? He made them into one stone. As the pasuk says later on, he took the stone that he placed by his head.
Both from Russia.
Rashi brings them together. So if Rashi brings them together, that means they got to work together. Because Rashi doesn't say davar. If Rashi meant to be two separate things, he would have said one thing, then he would say davar acher, another thing. They would have been separate things, which in Rashi not always so separate, but they could have been separate. Rashi doesn't do that. Rashi says he put them around his head of protection, and they began quarreling. That means he's putting it together. So how do you do that?
He doesn't explain for protection.
Rashi starts off saying for protection, and then he says they started fighting with each other.
And make one.
And made one. But that shouldn't work what you just said. So the answer that the Mizrahi gives, I think the Mizrahi gives this answer, yeah.
Not Rashi.
Not Rashi. No, not Rashi. The commentary of Rashi, Mizrahi answers an explanation that kind of takes the words of Rashi a little bit out of their straightforward meaning. And that when it says that each one said that tzaddik should rest his head on me, it doesn't mean to rest his head on them. It means to rest his head near them. Meaning, if you put rocks around the head, there's going to be some rocks that are going to be near the top of the head, and there's some rocks just around the side. The more important part of the head is the top, where the brain is. So a tzaddik's head, the top of a tzaddik's head, where his brain is, where he thinks, that's a very important part. So each one wanted to be at the top of the head. It doesn't mean to rest on the head. There's no point of resting on the head. But resting, each one should rest on me, means each one wants to be the one closest to the head, where the head would touch. Okay, each one wanted that. So what did Hashem do? Hashem turned them into one stone, and they all were doing that. By being one stone, they're all serving that purpose, because it's one stone. They're one unit. Okay. With that, now let's go to the other question we said. If, according to the other commentary of Rashi, the Maskala David, he put it around his entire body, why only mention the head? The answer is because it was only by the head ones that there was this quarrel, that they became one. They were the ones quarreling. The ones by the head were quarreling. The ones by the feet, they weren't quarreling. They're too far away. They're not by the head. If you're by the head, he says, he gives a mushal. If you have a king, so king has his close ministers, the ones who are always with him, and then you have the servants that are kind of further away. So the ones that are further away, they don't start fighting about, oh, I want to be up there. You have no connection there. But the ones that are in the front by the king, right? They all have that ability to be closest, so they all have a competition to be the closest. So the stones that were around his head, those were the stones that were the ones who had this quarrel and turned into one. And therefore, the Torah only mentions the stones around the head because it's trying to, again, it's saying this in the context, in connection with the miracle that happened where they all became one.
There is no any discussion about from stones to protect everything else.
There's nothing explicit. I told the commentary Maskala David says
this became one, but another.
According to the other ones, didn't become one. Just the ones around the head, because those were the ones that were quarreling about that. Right.
What is one?
Okay. Have a good evening. Thank you for listening. Be well.